The bitter wind of December 1886 howled through the narrow streets of Silver Creek, Colorado, carrying with it the acrid smell of coal smoke and the distant rumble of mining operations. Snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the ramshackle houses on the wrong side of town where families huddled around meager fires, praying their coal would last through another brutal night. Lonely Rancher pulled his worn coat tighter as he guided his horse through the muddy streets, the animal's breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. At 43, his weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen too much hardship, yet his steel-gray eyes still held a spark of compassion that years of solitude hadn't managed to extinguish. He had come to town for supplies, but something felt different today. An uneasiness that settled in his chest like a stone. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." "Please, sir, have you seen my boy?" A desperate voice cut through the wind. Lonely Rancher turned to see a woman in tattered clothes stumbling toward him, her face streaked with tears that had frozen on her cheeks. Martha Henderson. He recognized her, a widow who cleaned houses for the wealthy families up on Prosperity Hill. "Tommy's been missing for 3 days now," she sobbed, clutching at his coat sleeve. "He's only 8 years old. The sheriff says he probably just wandered off, but Tommy wouldn't do that. He knows better than to leave our street after dark." The rancher's jaw tightened. Sheriff Blackwood was known more for his loyalty to the mine owners than his dedication to justice. "When did you last see him, ma'am?" "Tuesday evening. He was playing with the other children near the old mill. When I called for supper, he was just gone." Her voice broke. "That's the 3rd child this month, sir. Little Sarah Murphy disappeared 2 weeks ago, and before that, the Kowalski boy." 3 children, all from the poorest families in town. All vanished without a trace. "What does the sheriff say about the others?" Martha's laugh was bitter. "Same thing. Says they probably ran away, looking for better opportunities in Denver. But these are good children from good families. They wouldn't just leave their mothers to worry sick." Lonely Rancher studied the woman's face, seeing the genuine anguish there. He had lived alone on his ranch for nearly 15 years, avoiding the complications of town life, but something about this situation stirred a long-dormant sense of purpose within him. "I'll keep my eyes open, Mrs. Henderson. If I hear anything—" "Bless you, sir. Most folks won't even listen anymore. They say it's just the way things are for people like us." As Martha hurried away, disappearing into the swirling snow, Lonely Rancher found himself unable to shake her words. He continued through town, his trained eye now noticing details he might have overlooked before. The way conversation stopped when he passed certain groups, the nervous glances exchanged between shopkeepers, the unusual number of well-dressed men conducting hushed business in doorways. At Morrison's general store, he overheard 2 miners talking in low voices. Heard they're expanding operations again. Need more workers for the new shaft. Where they gonna find 'em? Most able-bodied men in 3 counties are already working the mines. That's what I'm wondering. But Mr. Caldwell seems mighty confident about his labor supply." Jeremiah Caldwell, the wealthiest mine owner in Silver Creek, a man who lived in a mansion on Prosperity Hill while his workers barely scraped by in company housing. Lonely Rancher had never had direct dealings with Caldwell, but the man's reputation preceded him. Ruthless in business, influential in politics, and utterly indifferent to the suffering of those beneath his station. After purchasing his supplies, Lonely Rancher made an uncharacteristic decision. Instead of heading straight back to his ranch, he rode toward the mining district, following a hunch he couldn't quite explain. The snow was falling heavier now, muffling the sounds of his horse's hooves as he approached the main mining complex. What he saw there made his blood run cold. In a fenced area behind the main building, barely visible through the snow, he glimpsed small figures moving about, children working in conditions that would be harsh for grown men. They were loading coal into carts, their small hands red and raw from the cold, their faces smudged with soot and exhaustion. One of the children looked up, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, with the same dark hair and frightened expression that Martha Henderson had described when talking about her missing son. Lonely Rancher's heart pounded as he realized the horrifying truth beginning to unfold before him. These weren't just missing children. They were stolen children, forced into labor in conditions that would kill them within months. And if his suspicions were correct, the conspiracy reached far higher than he had imagined. A shout from one of the guards sent the children scurrying back to work, and Lonely Rancher quickly retreated before he could be spotted. But the image of those frightened young faces was burned into his memory. As he rode back toward his ranch through the deepening snow, his mind raced with the implications of what he had witnessed. 3 families were grieving for their lost children, while those same children were being worked to death in the mines that made men like Caldwell rich. The sheriff was either bought off or willfully ignorant, and the town's elite were profiting from the suffering of the most vulnerable. For 15 years, Lonely Rancher had chosen isolation over involvement, solitude over responsibility. He had convinced himself that the world's problems were too big for one man to solve, that it was better to tend his own land and leave others to their fate. But tonight, as he stared into the fire in his simple cabin, he knew that his days of isolation were over. Those children needed someone to fight for them, someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by doing what was right. Tomorrow, he would begin his investigation in earnest. He would find out exactly how deep this conspiracy went, who was involved, and most importantly, how to bring those children home safely. The wind howled outside his cabin, but Lonely Rancher no longer felt the cold. For the first time in years, he had a purpose that burned brighter than any fire. Dawn broke gray and unforgiving over Silver Creek, the snow having stopped during the night, but leaving behind a world transformed into sharp edges and dangerous beauty. Lonely Rancher had barely slept, his mind churning with plans and possibilities. He knew that confronting this conspiracy head-on would be suicide. Men like Caldwell didn't accumulate power by being careless about loose ends. He needed allies, information, and most importantly, proof that would be impossible to ignore or suppress. His first stop was the town's newspaper office, a cramped building wedged between a saloon and a barber shop. The Silver Creek Herald was run by Edmund Price, a man in his 50s whose idealistic journalism had been slowly ground down by years of economic pressure from the town's elite. When Lonely Rancher pushed through the door, he found Price hunched over his printing press, ink staining his fingers, and exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "We're closed," Price muttered without looking up. "I'm not here for a subscription," Lonely Rancher replied. "I'm here about the missing children." Price's hands stilled on the press. Slowly, he raised his head, studying the rancher with sharp, intelligent eyes. "What missing children? According to Sheriff Blackwood, there's no story there. Just runaways and family troubles. You and I both know that's not true." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Finally, Price straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. You know what happened to the last reporter who tried to investigate irregularities in the mining operations? He had an accident, fell down a mine shaft. Very tragic. I'm not a reporter. No, but you're asking dangerous questions. Price moved to the window, peering through the frost-covered glass. 3 children have disappeared in the past month, all from families who can't afford to make noise about it. All from families who depend on mine work to survive. You've been investigating. Price laughed bitterly. Investigating? I've been trying to stay alive while doing my job. There's a difference. He turned back to Lonely Rancher. But yes, I've been asking questions. Quietly. Very quietly. What have you found? Price hesitated, then moved to a locked drawer in his desk. He withdrew a folder filled with notes and newspaper clippings. Labor shortages. The mines have been pushing for increased production, but they can't find enough workers willing to do the most dangerous jobs. Adult miners have been organizing, demanding better safety conditions and higher wages. So they found a different kind of worker. Children work for food and shelter. They don't organize, they don't complain. And if they die, Price shrugged grimly. Poor children die all the time in places like Silver Creek. Who's going to investigate? Lonely Rancher studied the documents Price showed him. Production reports, shipping manifests, employment records that didn't quite add up. How high does this go? Higher than you want to know. Caldwell's the obvious suspect, but he's got partners. Investors from back east who don't care how their profits are made. Politicians who look the other way in exchange for campaign contributions. Even some of the local clergy who've been convinced that putting vagrant children to work is a form of Christian charity. The door chimed as someone entered the shop. Both men tensed, but it was only Mrs. Patterson, the baker's wife, looking for a copy of last week's paper. Price served her with forced cheerfulness, but Lonely Rancher could see the fear in his eyes. After she left, Price lowered his voice even further. There's something else. I've been tracking the timing of the disappearances with the mine's production schedules. Every time they get a big order, usually military contracts or railroad deals, children go missing within days. They're planning something big. The biggest military contract in the territory's history. Caldwell's been bragging about it for weeks. Enough coal to supply 3 army forts through the winter. Price's face was grim. If my calculations are right, they'll need at least a dozen more workers to meet that deadline. A dozen more children. The most vulnerable families in town, the ones who can't fight back. Lonely Rancher felt a cold fury building in his chest. I need to get inside that mining complex, see exactly what's happening to those children. That's suicide. The place is guarded around the clock. Not everywhere. I've been watching. There's a service entrance on the north side that's only manned during shift changes. Price stared at him. You're serious about this? Dead serious. Why? Price's question was simple, but Lonely Rancher could hear the deeper inquiry behind it. Why would a man who had spent 15 years avoiding human contact suddenly risk everything for children he didn't even know? Lonely Rancher was quiet for a long moment, remembering faces from his past. His own younger brother, who had died in a mining accident when they were both just boys. Their parents, who had never recovered from the loss. The years of guilt and isolation that had followed. Because someone has to, he said finally. And because I've spent too many years doing nothing while people suffered. Price nodded slowly. If you're going to do this, you'll need more than good intentions. You'll need evidence that can't be disputed or buried. Photographs if possible. Witness testimony, documentation. Can you help with that? I can provide the camera and the platform to publish whatever you find, but I can't go with you. I've got a family to think about. I understand. Price handed him a small camera and several photographic plates. "Be careful with these. They're expensive and hard to replace, and if you're caught with them, I won't be caught." As Lonely Rancher prepared to leave, Price grabbed his arm. "There's one more thing you should know. Word is that Caldwell's planning to move the operation soon. Somewhere more remote, where there's less chance of discovery. If those children are going to be saved, it has to be soon." "How soon?" "Days. Maybe a week at most." The weight of urgency settled on Lonely Rancher's shoulders like a physical burden. Not only did he need to gather evidence of the conspiracy, but he was racing against time to prevent the children from disappearing forever into some remote mining camp where they would never be found. As he stepped back into the cold morning air, he realized that his simple life of solitude was over forever. Whether he succeeded or failed, there would be no going back to his quiet ranch and peaceful isolation. He had chosen a side in a war he was only beginning to understand. But for the first time in 15 years, he felt truly alive. The moon was a thin sliver in the cloudy sky as Lonely Rancher approached the mining complex, his breath forming small puffs of vapor in the frigid air. He had spent the day observing the guards' routines, timing their patrols, and identifying the best route to the children's holding area. The camera and photographic plates were secured in a waterproof pouch beneath his coat, along with a small notebook for documenting what he found. The north entrance, just as he had observed, was unguarded during the shift change at midnight. The previous guards had departed, and the new ones wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. Barely enough time for what he needed to do, but it would have to suffice. Moving with the stealth learned from years of tracking wildlife on his ranch, Lonely Rancher slipped through the fence and made his way toward the wooden barracks where he had seen the children. The building was larger than it had appeared from a distance, with small, barred windows that leaked thin streams of yellow light into the darkness. As he approached the nearest window, he could hear voices inside. Not the voices of children, but of adults engaged in hushed conversation. "Shipment needs to be ready by Friday. The Army contract won't wait. We're pushing them as hard as we can. Any harder and we'll start losing them to exhaustion. Then get more. Caldwell says there are plenty of families in town who won't be missed." Lonely Rancher carefully raised his head to peer through the window. Inside, he saw two men in work clothes standing over a table covered with papers and ledgers. Beyond them, in the dim light, he could make out rows of small bunks where children lay sleeping, or trying to sleep despite the cold and their obvious exhaustion. He counted quickly, at least 15 children, ranging in age from perhaps 7 to 12. Their clothes were little more than rags, and even in sleep, their faces showed the gaunt hollowness of inadequate nutrition and overwork. One of the men inside moved toward the window, and Lonely Rancher quickly ducked down, his heart pounding. He waited several minutes before risking another look, but the men had moved to the far end of the building, giving him a clearer view of the children. With practiced efficiency, he set up the camera and began taking photographs, the flash powder creating brief, brilliant illuminations that he prayed wouldn't be noticed by the guards. Each photograph captured the horrible reality of the situation. Children sleeping on bare wooden bunks, their hands bandaged from injuries, their faces bearing the unmistakable marks of hard labor and poor treatment. In one corner of the room, he spotted a familiar face, Tommy Henderson, Martha's missing son. The boy was awake, staring at the ceiling with the hollow expression of someone far older than his 8 years. Seeing him confirmed what Lonely Rancher had suspected, but it also filled him with a rage so intense he had to force himself to remain calm and focused. Moving to another window, he discovered a second room where older children, mostly boys between 10 and 12, were housed. These children showed even more severe signs of abuse. Deeper cuts on their hands, more pronounced malnutrition, and the defeated posture of those who had given up hope of rescue. As he photographed this second group, one of the children stirred and looked directly at him through the window. For a moment, Lonely Rancher froze, certain that the boy would cry out and alert the guards. Instead, the child simply stared at him with wide, desperate eyes that seemed to plead for help. Lonely Rancher pressed his hand against the glass and mouthed the words, "I'll come back for you." The boy nodded slightly, then lay back down, pulling his thin blanket over his head. The sound of approaching footsteps sent Lonely Rancher scrambling away from the window. He had been inside the compound for nearly 15 minutes, longer than he had planned. As he made his way back toward the fence, he heard voices calling out behind him. "Did you see that light?" Probably just reflection off the snow, but check the perimeter anyway. Lonely Rancher reached the fence just as a guard rounded the corner of the main building, lantern in hand. He slipped through the gap in the fencing and rolled behind a pile of mining equipment just as the light swept across the area where he had been standing. "Nothing here," the guard called out. "Must have been your imagination." Lying in the snow behind the equipment, Lonely Rancher waited until the guards completed their patrol and returned to their posts. Only then did he risk moving, making his way carefully back to where he had left his horse. The ride back to town seemed endless, his mind racing with the implications of what he had witnessed and photographed. 15 children, maybe more, being worked under conditions that would be considered criminal even by the loose standards of 1886. And if Price's information was correct, this was only the beginning. Caldwell was planning to expand the operation and move it somewhere even more remote. But now he had evidence. Photographs that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Documentation of a crime so heinous that even the corrupt officials of Silver Creek would be forced to act. Or so he hoped. As he approached the newspaper office, he noticed that lights were still burning inside despite the late hour. Price was waiting for him, along with someone Lonely Rancher hadn't expected to see. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the town's only female physician and one of the few people in Silver Creek with both the medical knowledge to document the children's condition and the moral courage to stand up to the town's elite. "Edmund told me what you were planning," Dr. Mitchell said as he entered. "I've been treating some of these families, trying to help them cope with their losses. If you've found proof—" "I have proof," Lonely Rancher said, removing the camera and photographic plates from his coat. "The question is whether it will be enough." Price immediately began the process of developing the photographs, his hands working with practiced efficiency despite the urgency of the situation. As the images began to appear in the chemical baths, all three of them stared in horrified silence at the evidence of systematic child abuse and exploitation. "This is worse than I imagined, Doctor," Mitchell whispered. "These children are severely malnourished, probably suffering from exposure and exhaustion. Some of them may not survive much longer under these conditions." "Then we move tomorrow," Lonely Rancher said. "We publish these photographs, present the evidence to whatever honest officials we can find, and force action." "And if there are no honest officials?" Price asked. Lonely Rancher's jaw tightened. "Then we take action ourselves." The morning edition of the Silver Creek Herald hit the streets like a thunderbolt. Price had worked through the night, setting the photographs alongside a detailed exposé of the child labor conspiracy. The headline read, "Stolen Children, the Hidden Horror of Silver Creek's Mining Empire." Within hours, copies were being passed from hand to hand throughout the town, sparking outrage, denial, and fear in equal measure. Lonely Rancher stood in the newspaper office, watching through the window as crowds gathered in the street outside. Some were angry parents demanding action. Others were mine workers who had suspected something but been too afraid to speak out. But there were also well-dressed men who looked distinctly uncomfortable, and he noticed several of them hurrying toward the direction of Prosperity Hill. "Caldwell will try to suppress this," Dr. Mitchell said, studying the photographs one more time. "He has too much invested to let it stand." "Let him try," Price replied, but his voice carried a tremor of fear. "I've already sent copies to newspapers in Denver and Colorado Springs. This story is bigger than Silver Creek now." A commotion outside drew their attention. Sheriff Blackwood was pushing through the crowd, his face red with anger and what might have been panic. Behind him came 3 men Lonely Rancher recognized as Caldwell's personal security. Men who were known more for their willingness to use violence than their adherence to the law. "Here we go," Lonely Rancher muttered, checking that his revolver was loaded and ready. Blackwood burst through the door without knocking, his hand resting on his gun. "Price, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "My job," Price replied calmly. "Reporting the news. This is libel, slander. You're printing lies about respected businessmen." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward, her medical bag in hand. "Sheriff, I've examined several of the families whose children have disappeared. I can provide medical testimony about their conditions before they vanished, and I'm prepared to examine the children when they're recovered to document the abuse they've suffered." "There are no missing children," Blackwood shouted, "just runaways and troublemakers." "Then you won't mind if we organize a search of the mining complex," Lonely Rancher said quietly. "If there's nothing to hide, Caldwell should welcome the opportunity to clear his name." Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he focused on the rancher. I should have known you'd be behind this. Always knew you were trouble. The only trouble here is the systematic abuse of children for profit. You have no proof." Lonely Rancher gestured to the photographs spread across Price's desk. "I have all the proof I need." One of Caldwell's men whispered something in Blackwood's ear, and the sheriff's expression grew even more grim. "Those photographs could have been taken anywhere. They prove nothing." "Then let's go to the mine right now, Doctor," Mitchell suggested. "Let's see what we find." Before Blackwood could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "That won't be necessary." Everyone turned to see Jeremiah Caldwell himself standing in the doorway, flanked by 2 more armed men. At 55, Caldwell was an imposing figure, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from years of wielding unchallenged power. But today, there was something different in his eyes. The look of a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. "Mr. Caldwell," Price said, his voice steady despite the obvious danger, "I don't suppose you'd like to comment on the story?" Caldwell smiled, but it was a cold expression devoid of warmth. "I'd like to discuss a business proposition. You see, gentlemen and lady, you've stumbled onto something that's much bigger than you realize. This isn't just about Silver Creek. There are interests involved here that reach all the way to Washington. Children are being enslaved," Lonely Rancher said bluntly. "There's no business proposition that justifies that." "Enslaved?" Caldwell laughed. "These are orphans and runaways who would otherwise starve on the streets. We're providing them with food, shelter, and valuable job training. It's practically a charitable enterprise." "Charitable enterprises don't require armed guards and barbed wire," Dr. Mitchell observed. Caldwell's expression hardened. "The world is changing. and those who can't adapt get left behind. The old ways of doing business, worrying about every individual hardship, are inefficient. Progress requires sacrifice. Whose sacrifice? Lonely Rancher asked. Yours, or just the children who can't fight back? You're all missing the bigger picture, Caldwell continued. This operation provides coal for military installations across the territory. National security depends on operations like mine. A few dozen children learning the value of hard work is a small price to pay for the security of thousands. You're insane, Price said quietly. Caldwell shrugged. I'm practical, and I'm offering you a choice. Accept a generous payment for your silence, and this all goes away. Continue with this crusade, and you'll discover just how many powerful people have an interest in maintaining the status quo. The room fell silent, except for the sound of the crowd growing larger outside. Through the window, Lonely Rancher could see that word of the confrontation was spreading. More. Families were gathering, including several he recognized as parents of missing children. There's your answer, Lonely Rancher said, nodding toward the window. Those people deserve to know what happened to their children. Caldwell followed his gaze, and his confidence seemed to waver slightly. Sheriff, I think it's time to restore order. Blackwood reached for his gun, but before he could draw it, the door burst open again. This time it was Martha Henderson, followed by a dozen other parents, and what appeared to be half the town's population. "Where's my boy?" Martha demanded, her voice carrying the authority of desperate maternal love. "Where's Tommy?" The crowd pressed into the small office, and suddenly Caldwell's armed men seemed far less intimidating. Faced with an angry mob of parents demanding answers, even corrupt officials had to consider the political consequences of their actions. "The children are at the mining complex," Dr. Mitchell announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "We have photographs proving they're being held there against their will." "Then let's go get them," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Now wait just a minute." Blackwood tried to protest, but his voice was drowned out by the angry voices of the crowd. Lonely Rancher found himself at the center of a movement he had never intended to lead. Looking around at the faces of the parents, the concerned citizens, and even some of the mine workers who had finally found the courage to stand up to their employers, he realized that this was bigger than just rescuing the children. This was about the soul of Silver Creek itself. "We go together," he announced. "All of us. And we don't leave until every child is safe." The crowd roared its approval, and even Caldwell seemed to realize that his carefully constructed conspiracy was collapsing around him. As the mob surged toward the door, heading for the mining complex, Lonely Rancher caught sight of Caldwell's face. The man's expression had shifted from confidence to fear to something approaching panic. The reckoning had begun. Epilogue. Redemption in Silver Creek. 3 months later, Silver Creek was a different town. The mining complex had been raided that very day, and all 15 children had been rescued and returned to their families. Tommy Henderson was back home with his mother, slowly recovering from his ordeal, but alive and safe. Caldwell and his conspirators faced federal charges after the story reached newspapers across the country, sparking a national investigation into child labor practices in mining operations. Sheriff Blackwood had been removed from office and replaced by a man who actually believed in justice. Lonely Rancher still lived on his ranch, but he was no longer truly alone. The families he had helped rescue their children had become an extended community, and hardly a week went by without someone stopping by to share a meal or ask for advice. He had discovered that helping others was far more fulfilling than the isolation he had once cherished. Dr. Mitchell had established a clinic specifically for treating the long-term effects of the children's ordeal, funded by donations from across the territory. Price's newspaper had gained national recognition for its investigative reporting, and he had used his newfound influence to continue exposing corruption wherever he found it. Most importantly, the children were healing. Some bore physical scars that would never fully fade, but with proper care, nutrition, and the love of their families, they were rediscovering what it meant to be children rather than laborers. On a warm spring evening, as Lonely Rancher sat on his porch watching the sunset, he reflected on how much his life had changed. He had spent 15 years believing that isolation was safety, that avoiding involvement was the path to peace. But he had learned that true peace came not from avoiding the world's problems, but from having the courage to stand up and fight for what was right. In the distance, he could see the lights of Silver Creek beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. It was a town transformed, a community that had rediscovered its moral compass through the courage of ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things. And for the first time in his adult life, Lonely Rancher was no longer lonely. He had found his purpose, his community, and his redemption in the most unlikely of places, in the fight to protect those who could not protect themselves. The children of Silver Creek were safe, and their protector had finally come home. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.